Ayakwi, Neknamalita, and this is my channel, The Midnight Librarian, and today I will be talking about my January wrap-up. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in just because there are a couple more stats that I want to include that may make this a little longer, but I will say that so far January got that done in 2024. I thought it was relatively good pace and I feel like I'm still fairly motivated. There was a bit of a slump due to stress, but other than that I feel like I did really well. I did read 10 books for the month, which was secretly my soft goal. I know it's like typically the goal because there are 10 cards and Pokemon booster packs that I use to choose my TBR. However, being a mood reader, it's not always guaranteed that that's going to happen. I don't think that's ever happened in the 2 years that I've been doing it. 10 is always just the goal. Not always. For January, it was the goal. I didn't say anything in my January TBR. I'm not going to say anything in any of my TBRs just because I think that's added pressure. And I don't need that. I will say that by the 9th book, I was hoping to surpass that 10 book goal by at least one. However, due to reaching my limit in hours of audiobooks through Spotify, wasn't able to do it. I have like an hour and 50 minutes left in a book that I'm listening to through Spotify, and I hit by 15 hours and have to wait until my Spotify renews in like 10 days. It's so annoying. I hate that hour mark thing. Just do units. So 10 books equates to 3,175 pages and 56.21 hours listened to. I had one reread and one DNF, which is not counting towards any of the stats that I'm about to list off. I don't count them towards my stats. I don't like to. I haven't quite messed with that in this year's reading spreadsheet from Allie from Hardback Hoarder, but I know that in the 2023 version it did include it within all my reading stats, so I haven't messed with it yet just because I want to see. Anyway, I'll talk about that later. In terms of genres, I have one contemporary, one fantasy, one historical, 2 mystery, 3 nonfiction, and 2 sci-fi. All of the books were novels. 6 were audiobooks, 4 were physical, 6 were new to me authors, and 4 I've read from before. 1 was, I don't know if it's self-published or traditionally published, if it's gone through Amazon to get published. I don't know how that works entirely, but otherwise 9 were traditionally published. The Penguin Random House having 4 books that I've read for the month of January, or their imprints. So I tend to go with the parent company as opposed to the imprints. In terms of acquirement of these books, I have 1 book box, 2 from the bookstore, 1 that was gifted to me, and 4 from Libro, and 4 are a part of a series while 6 were standalones. And then in terms of audience, 8 were adult, 1 was young adult, and 1 was children's. And then we also have publication year, 1937, 2017, 2018, 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2024. An interesting part I thought was interesting as well was the country it is set in. We have several in the United States, 4 to be exact, at various points. I do have a map that shows where specifically around the world. We have 1 that was kind of set in France, kind of set in the UK, as well as mid-Atlantic, 1 that was set in South Korea but also United States, and 1 set in Canada. And then we have 2 technically that were set in fictional places, Middle Earth being one of them, as well as a fictional, is it fictional? I'm not entirely sure. I need to look it up, but I think it's science fiction. So I think I'm pretty sure it's fictional, a fictional moon. And then another one that was set on the moon, our moon, real moon. And then for diversity, I have 6 diverse books, 3 LGBTQIA+, and 3 that were own voices. I quote own voices just because I know, particularly with Indigenous authors, it's kind of hard to, like, just in general, I guess, but and it's own voices is so, it's just a little iffy, but I think these are all interesting. My apologies if you don't. Maybe I can start bookmarking where the stats start and begin, and where my actual reviews for the books that I read start. For my Pokemon Chooses My TBR, I read 7 of the prompts that were pulled, which is great. I think that's like the highest amount that I've done so far. I did have a couple replacements, and I'll get into one of them now. For Regirock, which was a fighting Pokemon. It was to read a book by an author I've read from before, and for this I had chosen The Paris Apartment by Lucy Foley. I read the guest list from Lucy Foley, and it was alright. It was entertaining enough that I finished the book and thought it was interesting and was interested to learn more about Lucy Foley, but not good enough that I wanted a physical copy. I think I actually had a physical copy from Book of the Month, but I think I gave it away. The Paris Apartment, we are following a young woman who needs to flee the United Kingdom, and she ends up asking her brother if she can come stay with him in his Paris apartment. He's not excited about this. He thinks it's too soon, but he can't say no to her, or doesn't want, I don't know, and says that he'll wait up for her because she's already on her way. But as she gets to the apartment, he's not answering his phone, he's not answering the door. She ends up finding her way in, and it looks to be that he left in a hurry. She doesn't know where he went. But there's things that don't quite add up. His keys and his wallet are still in the house, and it seems to be that the neighbors within this apartment complex have this unifying mentality to lie to her about her brother, while also not liking him and not liking that she's in his apartment. I only got like 20% of the way through this. I'm finding I just don't like it when characters lie. I know that's like it feels silly to admit that, but it's something particularly with this book that I've recognized of just like there was so much lying by omission, or just straight up lying that I just didn't like, as well as I didn't connect with the main character. I thought that she had this like poor me mentality because her and her brother shared a mom, had different dads, and then something happened with their mom that they got into the foster system. Her brother was adopted out while she had to move from foster home to foster home, but because he got adopted out by a wealthy family, she's in the mindset that he grew up privileged and that because they're family, she's owed something. I didn't like this, and particularly because she kept using that as, oh, come on, we're family, to get her way, but only to then discover something about her brother that she didn't know about, like that fact that he had a cat. She didn't know he liked cats. That felt like something he should know about. Does he have a girlfriend? There were so many things that she's like, well, I'm his sister, like I'm his family, he wouldn't do that to me, but she didn't take the time to like know anything about him either. So it just felt really just contradictory, and I just didn't like her mentality. So I didn't really care to listen more into this book, which I had on loan through Libby, and just didn't care anymore. So I DNF'd it. I will get into the replacement book that I picked out for Regirock here shortly, but let's go ahead and get into the books that I did read for 2024. My first book of the year was The Hobbit. This is to fulfill the trainer card Celine, which was to read a mood read. This one I have been wanting to read since before the holidays. I like rereading J.R.R. Tolkien, or reading something from J.R.R. Tolkien around the holiday season, just because I like the adventure of it. This one in particular I thought would be really fun to read at the beginning of 2024, because as I said, it's my 33rd year. In 2024, the 33rd year is the year a Hobbit becomes an official adult, kind of like our 18th in the United States. 18 is your adult age, 33 is the Hobbits, and I thought that would be really fun to lean into, and particularly really fun to read this book and its adventures for the beginning of 2024. So if you don't know, The Hobbit it's a classic children's book written by J.R.R. Tolkien, the same author for The Lord of the Rings. This is actually technically a prequel where we follow Bilbo Baggins, who is a hobbit and ends up kind of getting coerced into going on an adventure with 13 dwarves and the wizard Gandalf to try to take back the kingdom under the mountain that the dwarves had before a dragon murdered their kin and took over the kingdom. So I absolutely love this. I love the movies. I listened to this through, because I purchased it through Libro a couple years ago with Andy Serkis narrating. Andy Serkis does the voice acting for Gollum in the movies, and he takes large inspiration from his fellow cast members in the narration of the books, which I absolutely love. And he does really good in terms of the singing and stuff, because there are lyrics in both the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings series. So yeah, of course this was like 5 out of 5 stars for me. It actually got bumped up because it's becoming a nostalgia for me, because I think for a while I had it at 4.5. There is some comments that the Doors make towards a particularly heavy set dwarf and tend to poke fun at him, so there is like fat phobic comments throughout the book poking fun at him, so just as a heads up. But other than that, I really love this adventure, and I really think it's a fun, good origin story leading into the Lord of the Rings. So the next book that I finished was not a part of my January TBR. It was actually a rollover. I started it in December and wanted to finish it, and that is In the Quick by Kate Hope Day. I absolutely love this cover, this like powder pink. What looks to be almost like a painting of an astronaut. I wonder who that's by. I never looked into that. So, book design by Alex Capitini. So, but this one is science fiction, and we are following June, who is a brilliant but difficult child. She is adopted by her uncle and her aunt. Her uncle is an engineer for a fictional space program, and he designed like, was it like a generator, not a generator, but like a power source for spaceships. And he encourages June to like figure out how something works, whether it's taking it apart and putting it back together, however. So he encourages her to do that, so she's constantly tinkering and taking things apart and putting things back together to try to like invent something more convenient, which tends to irritate the hell out of her aunt and her cousin. So when her uncle dies, he's no longer like the mitigator between the two, and there becomes altercations between June and her aunt, and particularly her cousin. So her aunt ends up pulling some strings to get June into a fictional school in the space program that typically only takes 14-year-olds and up, and June's only 12, but she manages to get in there because of her aunt's pull in the system, because of her uncle. And she makes friends of sorts who also find her difficult but brilliant. And basically June's whole goal after her uncle dies is to figure out what the problem was for his power source for these spaceships, because one particular spaceship that had his power source, it was like one of the first ones, goes into space and they lose contact. They like are stalled in space. No one's able to do anything. So while she's in school, they start debating if another crew should go up and save them, and the space program deems that it's too much of a risk because they don't know if the crew is alive or not. So June wants to figure out if they are or not, and ultimately wants to solve the issue of her uncle's power source, because I thought this was really interesting. I loved figuring, like, kind of walking through things with June, even though I had no idea what she was talking about. It was interesting to see her thought process in terms of like, there was like this experimental hand that she was working on with a team of like how a mechanical hand to like grip and do stuff in space, and how it was working and how it wasn't, and she was constantly thinking about it, and like the question of what does a hand do. It was really just interesting. I liked being in her perspective. However, I felt like the like last third, maybe last quarter of the book was really lackluster. It was a bit surprising. There were some elements that I'm just like, oh, okay, I didn't see that coming. But in the last like quarter of the book, I felt like at the ending, it just kind of like drifted. It just felt like it just drifted and then just stopped. And that was it. That was it. That's all we got. And it was like, to me, it wasn't that last, not only was it drifting, it was kind of meandering, and I felt like there wasn't like a solid conclusion really. And like, I mean, there was of sorts, like we kind of get the answer and June kind of gets to do what she does, but I feel like it could have ended better. But I ultimately like still enjoyed it, and it's still something that I think about. So the next book that I read was Unsinkable by Jenny L. Walsh. This was a ALC through Libro, and it's actually one of anticipated books of 2024. It was in my January 2024 anticipated releases. So it was available, and thank you to Libro. It was actually really exciting, and I think I ended up switching. So When the Sky Fell on Splendor, I didn't end up reading that, and so I switched. I didn't end up reading that for the energy card. That's why I read Unsinkable, and that fits for that. But basically, this is a historical fiction, and we are following Violet, who has been on several like maritime tragedies in terms of like the Titanic sinking as well as another boat sinking. She survived several sinkings, and she continues on, and people are wondering like how she's able to continue on in terms of like another cruise or another boat to work on when she's been on so many. It is inspired by a true story. But we also have an alternate perspective of Daphne, who not only an alternate perspective but an alternate timeline. It's later on during World War II, and with Violet it's before World War One, because we get to Violet's perspective just before the Titanic sinks, and we get to Daphne's perspective in the midst of World War II. Daphne is being recruited to be a resistor in France, and to help sabotage the Nazi party. And eventually like the timelines meet up, and it's really interesting. However, I really enjoyed Violet's perspective more. That's why I started reading the book, is because I was really particularly interested in the idea of someone surviving the sinking of the Titanic and then continuing to work on boats in the same manner. So Violet essentially is like an housekeeper of sorts on these cruises. And it was just a really interesting perspective, and I really enjoyed it. And because I later learned in the author's note that it was based off a woman named Violet who did survive the sinking of the Titanic and actually had some of the stuff that Jenny Walsh put in this book in her memoir, I thought it was really well developed. Violet was a really complex character, and I really enjoyed it. Daphne, however, felt very lackluster, and the whole woman spy in World War II, it's an interesting concept, but it's not a new one, and so it didn't really strike anything. Sorry. It didn't really like inspire anything. And particularly at the end, I thought it was just very cinematic, over dramatic. There were multiple like coming togethers, like one right after the other, that like the first one I was like, okay, yeah, I guess that makes sense, but it was a little lackluster. The second one made me teary, and the third one I had me eye rolling going, wait, really? So it was just kind of like, it tied up too nicely and too neat. Like wasn't the biggest fan of that. But I am interested in seeing what else Jenny Walsh has to offer, and I really enjoy this cover. So it may take it a little bit, but I may end up getting a physical copy just because I do enjoy the cover, and I did ultimately enjoy Violet's perspective. Next, I ended up reading Been There, Done That, A Rousing History of Sex, and this by Rachel Feldman. I noticed I got a couple like dislikes on my TBR video, and I'm pretty sure it's because of this cover. It just made me laugh. So let's see. Been There, Done That. That was for Shieldon, which is a steel Pokemon, which is to read a nonfiction. And Been There, Done That also fulfilled the buzzword for the month, which was the 3 theirs. And basically, it's as it says, it's a nonfiction about the history of sex. Ultimately, it was okay. I felt like Rachel Feldman went over some stuff that like I've known before. There was a couple of little interesting bits, but honestly, like thinking about it now because I read it or listened to it read it, listened to it at the beginning of the month, I couldn't tell you like what some of the interesting things that popped out at me were, aside from some of like the misconceptions of sex throughout our medical history in terms of like, oh, people, male doctors were telling women to sneeze in order to get semen out of them after having sex so they wouldn't get pregnant. Oh my goodness. So just kind of like the ridiculousness of medical history like that is the only thing that really popped out, but otherwise it's not been there, done that, wasn't all that memorable to me. And like I said, a lot of the things that Rachel Feldman had gone over wasn't new to me. But I feel like if you are interested in the history of, or getting into like a history of something, this might be interesting to you. I don't know. It was okay. Glad I listened to it, I guess. But it was just okay. Next, I listened to Crying in Hmart by Michelle Zauner. This one has made its rounds through BookTube multiple times in the last couple years. And I say, where did I? Oh, I actually just listened to this on Spotify. So I am trying out Spotify audiobooks. And was curious to see how it would work. So I listened. This is the one book that I haven't rated, but it was another nonfiction. If you haven't heard about it, we are following Michelle Zauner as she kind of goes through the grief and loss of her mother, who died of cancer several years ago, and basically how Hmart, as well as Korean cooking, had always felt like a way for her to connect with her mother, and to connect with her Korean roots, because she is mixed race, and grew up in Oregon. So it was interesting. I definitely thought, like, I don't rate memoirs, so because it's someone's life, it feels fairly odd to me, but as itself, I thought it was well written. I thought that there were a couple moments that definitely had me crying at work, of course. So it was I definitely had to get up to like use the copier a couple times just to like clear my eyes away. And it's definitely that impact of how cancer can affect us, and how seeing the deterioration of our loved ones and being sick and making decisions of like, you know, they don't want to go through chemo again because it didn't work the first time, and they want to be able to live, and they want to live their life, have a better quality of life as opposed to the amount of years lived. That was definitely like hit in a way, and it like, particularly after losing my brother in 2018 and being fixated on death to better prepare myself from when like someone else happens to leave me, this definitely made me question of what would happen if I lost my mom, which is definitely hard to wrap my head around, but it is something that my mom and I talk about because she's had a couple health scares, and ultimately we all know that we're like, none of us are immortal, so it's something that we are trying to strategically plan, and that's easier said than done when it's put into practice, of course. So it was definitely, I think, an interesting conversation, and I'm glad we had it, and we continue to have it, particularly as like, you know, my grandparents are getting older, like anyway, so yeah. So it was definitely interesting and definitely impactful. Okay, and the next book that I read was Find Me by Anne Fraser. This one worked for Glam Meow, which was to read a contemporary. This one we are following a couple perspectives, but basically we have this detective, Daniel, a detective who is being called on by a convicted serial killer, Benjamin Fisher. Benjamin Fisher offers to show the San Bernardino County Police where he's buried his victims, or some of his victims. If he gets to go with them, has to show them personally. He can't show them on a map. And if they will get a specific FBI profiler to join them. That FBI profiler happens to be Benjamin Fisher's daughter, who unwittingly was a participant in her father's luring the victims to him as a child. So this one was kind of it was interesting. So we also get Rennie, who's the daughter, Rennie Fisher's perspective. She's no longer an FBI profiler because of a panic attack she ended up having. Daniel Ellis comes to ask her about it, and she ends up, okay, so this is where I start having issues with this. Daniel Ellis ends up convincing her to, not that it took much convincing, to help him with this, to join him and her father to find the victims. However, this is of course bringing up a bunch of stuff for Rennie that she thought she had buried. Like, one big thing happens. Daniel has this realization of like, oh, this is affecting her a lot more than, like, oh my goodness, like this is probably like really affecting her. It's like, yeah, you made her come out with her dad to come find victims. How would you not think that was going to be an effect on her? And then later, after another big thing happens, he's like, oh, this is really having an effect on her. I'm like, you didn't learn the first time? What's wrong with you? So I had issue with it in terms of that, but it was entertaining enough that I finished the book and I was pretty interested. I didn't expect the twist, honestly. I don't know. And so I have a love-hate relationship with true crime. This one, because it's fiction, I feel better about reading it because it's not outright pulling from and taking advantage of victims or their families' stories like a lot of actual true crime does. Netflix, I'm looking at you. I enjoyed Criminal Minds, and this kind of gave me that vibe. I haven't watched Criminal Minds in a while just because so many different cast changes, and it actually kind of scared me after a bit. So, but yeah, so this one was interesting enough. I'm curious about the second book in this duology, and I still really enjoy the cover. It was fine. Next, I read When the Crow's Away by Orly Wallace. This is the second book in the Evenfall, which is B&B duology, and this fit for Reggie Rock in replacing the Paris Apartment by reading a book that from an author that I've read from before. I read the first book in the series, which I forgot what the name was called, but basically we are following Bryn. I forget her last name. We are following Bryn, who in the first book, she is going over something ends up happening. She is going through some grief and loss, and moves in with her aunts who own a B&B in Evenfall. Bryn and her aunt are witches. However, the town knows they're quirky, knows there's something up with them, but doesn't believe they're witches. In the first one, a guest at the B&B dies. It's considered an accident, but when police start looking into it, they start pointing or believe that one of the aunts were involved. So Bryn has to figure out who actually was behind it to clear her aunt's name. In the second one, a local in Evenfall ends up dying, and his ghost comes to Bryn and demands that she help him figure out who did it. And that's basically that. I don't want to spoil it any more than that. I would say that the first one was a bit stronger. I liked the conversations we had around grief and loss, and particularly about how people grieve differently and how we can kind of get stuck. The second one wasn't bad, but it felt more meandery, and I don't think I would have done what Bryn did and been as patient with this ghost as she was in terms of finding his killer. But I do, of course, love the magic elements. This duology is often compared to Gilmore Girls and Practical Magic. I haven't watched Gilmore Girls outside of a couple episodes. I found it boring, so I can't say that. But Practical Magic, the movie, yes. The book I don't think was as magical as the movie. But yes, the ants in the Evenfall, which is a B&B, very much reminds me of the two ants in Practical Magic, and Bryn reminds me of Sandra Bullock's character. So, just as a heads up. But yeah, I enjoyed it. I'm glad that I read it. I do hope to have physical copies at some point. It might take a little bit, but I do hope to have them. Next, I ended up reading The Rise and Fall of the Dinosaurs, A New History of a Lost World by Steve Broussat. I thought it was really interesting that Kayla from Books and Law also read this one during the month of January for her dinosaur vlog. This one fulfilled, which one? Was my Reggie Steele card, which was to read a backlist nonfiction. That's what the reverse halo is, and Steele is to read a nonfiction. And it's also one of my 24 of 2024 books to read, which was also helpful. So, this one, I mean, it's pretty much as it says. It's The Rise and Fall of the Dinosaurs by Steve Broussat. I mean, Steve Broussat is a paleontologist, and I don't really have anything else to say outside of what Kayla had already said, in all honesty. I enjoyed it. I thought it was fun. I rated it for 4 stars because it was enjoyable, and I will say that I did see the negative comments about this, that he did name drop a bunch of people that he kind of explained who they were, but not really. But it just felt like a lot of name drop after name drop. He was also listing a bunch of dinosaur names that I had no idea what they look like or anything. I think this would have benefited from not just listening to it, but having it physically. And because I think Kayla had said that there were some illustrations or photos within the book itself, and I think that would have been helpful. But the whole time I was listening to this, I thought about how cool this would be for a dinosaur kid. I was never a dinosaur kid, though I did watch The Land Before Time, which I'm hearing from other people who were dinosaur kids where it was like not good. But particularly what I'm thinking is that I have a friend who has a little boy who is very much a dinosaur kid and hates Land Before Time because they don't use the accurate names for the dinosaurs, and how cool he would think this book was if it was accessible for him. Just because I do think that this is an adult book in terms of conceptualizing and like some of the things that Steve Broussat talks about. I think if it was redone for like a young reader, it would be so cool for dinosaur kids, in my opinion. So that's all I could think about the whole time I was listening to it. There were some elements that I'm like, okay, I kind of get that, and it kind of helped explain to me the different time periods in terms of the Triassic period versus Jurassic period. I still would have to like read several more books and have like a physical diagram of a timeline to best understand it, but there were some really cool concepts in there, as well as like some interesting facts in terms of like there's a new dinosaur being found every 15 minutes, and I agree with Kayla in that it felt like as a child I remember a couple of them being discovered or found, and it was a huge deal. It was on the news, and now like it's not so much in people's minds because it's not that much of a novelty anymore, because they do find them every 15 minutes or something. I don't know. I just thought it was really interesting, and I think it's very curious. So I think in the future I would like to read more books involving dinosaurs or like dinosaur history, or I thought Steve did a really good job. I saw that, like I said, saw the comments about him name dropping either people or dinosaurs and like them thinking that this was the most boring book ever. I don't think so. I thought this was really entertaining, but like I said, I think I would have benefited from having a physical book in front of me to better navigate what he was saying. And I'm also just very much a visual learner. So that would have helped solidify some of the things that I was learning from him. But other than that, like I don't know how this book could have been done better. So yeah, it was fun. Next, I ended up reading Son of a Trickster by Ian Robinson. This was also on my 24 of 2024 reading challenge for this year, as well as my choice for Per Ugly, which was to read a contemporary. For this one, Ian Robinson is a Indigenous author from Canada, so First Nations, and we are following Jared, who is a teen. He's in high school. I think he's like a sophomore or I think he's a sophomore. And basically he is the only one really taking care of himself because his mom's a drug seller with her boyfriend and like is constantly having people go in and out of her house, and is partying all the time. And Jared is just trying to make a little money to make sure that their like electricity stays on, or that, you know, he can feed himself. So he tries to make pot cookies on the side and sell them on the side. However, there is something weird going on after he like, on a particular day is something weird going on. A crow ends up talking to him and he kind of writes it off as him being either hungover or high. But then things continue to get weird. It kind of coincides with what he's heard as a kid when his mom's mom, his maternal grandmother, said that he was the son of a trickster, that like he shouldn't be trusted, that like he's, I don't know, that she's always hated him and he never understood why. I thought the intro to this was really interesting as we get Jared as a kid and we kind of get like that bit explained a bit better in terms of like why his mom left his maternal grandmother, that she thought she was crazy, and went and to his paternal grandmothers, who just absolutely adored Jared. And it's like we see that connection get formed and made, and then like we kind of get caught up later like after that, and like his mom splitting up with his dad, how vengeful his mom can be and heartbroken, as well as just like the temper she has. Ultimately I found this book really slow. It's like a very like character driven book, and we basically go through Jared's whole year as a sophomore, and it felt very slow. It felt very meandery. I don't know what else to say about it. I wasn't that impressed. I think this was my 2.5 star. I hate giving Indigenous authors low ratings. I feel like I'm like exhibiting lateral violence, but it's like it didn't connect with me. I've heard that the series gets better in the second book, which I will most likely try just because I do love this cover and I want to like this series. But I was just kind of disappointed in this particularly. Not only so when the stuff actually starts happening, which I feel like is like the very tail end of the book, Jared has a hard time believing it, and even when he starts going like, okay, starts wrapping his mind around it, he's stubborn enough that he doesn't want to learn about it. So, and then all the other characters make it seem that we should already know this, and what a dumbass we are for not knowing this. I say we, but it's like Jared, but it also feels like us. Which is, and it's just interesting point, but it makes me like understand Jared in terms of like, fuck you. But at the same time, I don't understand why he wouldn't want to learn more about it, particularly as he's in danger. So, I don't know. It was just, I have mixed feelings and thoughts. Ultimately, I just found it disappointing. So, finally, my last book of the month was Aremis by Andy Weir. This fulfilled masculine, which is a water Pokemon, which is to read a book that is set on a different country, continent, or planet. This is actually set on the moon. So, and this also works for reading a book of the month book for the month, which was perfect. And I ultimately had wanted another sci-fi because I was reading In the Quick when making my TBR for January. And in this one we are following, how do I explain this? Okay, Jasmine Bashara, also known as Jazz, never signed up to be a hero. She just wanted to get rich. Not crazy, eccentric billionaire rich like many of the visitors to her hometown of Aremis, humanity's first and only lunar colony, just rich enough to move out of her coffin-sized apartment and eat something better than flavored algae. Rich enough to pay off a debt she's owed for a lifetime. Or for a long time. So when a chance at a huge score finally comes her way, Jazz can't say no. Sure, it requires her to graduate from small-time smuggler to full-on criminal mastermind, and it calls for a particular combination of cunning, technical skills, and large explosions, not to mention sheer brazen swagger, but Jazz has never run into a challenge her intellect can't handle, and she figures she's got the swagger part down. The trouble is, engineering the perfect crime is just the start of Jazz's problems, because her little heist is about to land her in the middle of a conspiracy for control of Aremis itself. Okay, so I've read The Martian before, and I didn't mind it. I don't think I would have enjoyed it as much if I hadn't watched the movie first, because there was a lot of science talk that had me kind of, my eyes glazed over, and I was trying to understand it. This one is kind of similar, but it was fun in a way, because even though I get that, like, The Martian was also science fiction because, like, we were on Mars, this one just felt more interesting in that Jazz is living on the moon, and there was different logical aspects within that of how cities came to be, and like what the differences are from living on the moon than it is to live on Earth. Gravity's not the same. You can run up like 5 flights of stairs and not get winded. You can jump like 3 stories down and not get hurt. Different aspects like that, as well as the political intrigue in terms of technically they're not a sovereign nation. In any way, they're a branch of Kenya. I don't know. There was so much different aspects. I'm like, okay, this is interesting. Like the world building aspect was really interesting and cool. I would say that Jazz Bashara is not the most likable character. I get why she did what she did, but at the same time, her decisions weren't the best. Oh, I rated this 4 stars. So yeah, it was fun. I think I would put it above The Martian. I have to reread The Martian. But ultimately thought that this was very entertaining, and it was very much like, okay, so that's part of it too, is that like Jazz wouldn't have been in some of these situations because like if she had not made some of the decisions she had made, which I get that, like you could say that about anything, right? But like her situations kept going from bad to worse because she didn't think through the consequences. So that was like one of the problems I had, but otherwise like really entertaining book. So I'm very interested in reading more from Andy Weir, so very much interested in continuing on with Project Hail Mary as soon as I get a physical copy. So yeah, those were the books that I read for the month of January. Yeah, if you read any of these, please let me know your thoughts down in the comments down below, and if you made it this far, let's go ahead and put a moon emoji, any kind of moon emoji or space emoji for Aremis, as well as in the quick. I do hope to get more into science fiction this year. I feel like I was into it for a little bit and then slacked off the last couple years, just because science fiction is one of those ones, like I'm realizing with fantasy that it's not going to go over my head if I take my time with it, but I feel like science fiction, I'm realizing that with science fiction, but it's still hard for me to convince myself of that, because there are particularly with Andy Weir that there were elements that I'm just like, I'm not smart enough for this book, but it's still interesting to read. So anyway, that's my thoughts on that. Yeah, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for supporting, and I hope that you are in the mental mindset to enjoy your reading, and I will see you in another video very soon. Cheers.